Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I will be doing a top 5 favorite Star Trek standalone novels. Now, I've done top 5 Star Trek Voyager books and series, I've done top 5 Star Trek overall series, I've done ranking my favorite Star Trek authors, I've done lots of Star Trek videos. I haven't really delved into the concept of Star Trek standalone books, and that is mostly because I am not quite as well versed in the standalone Star Trek novel verse. I haven't done an accurate count, but I've probably read something like 20 or 25 standalones, and then I've read about 40 or plus of books from different Star Trek actual series. So I'm more versed in the series area, but still, I've read some standalones. I've read some great ones and some not great ones. But today I'm talking about the great ones. So without further ado, let's get into my number 5. My number 5 is Star Trek The Next Generation, Kahless by Michael Jan Friedman. This was a book that I just found fascinating. The first thing I'll say is, if you know my channel, you know I'm a big fan of John Jackson Miller, and his Prey trilogy featured Klingons and featured the character of Kahless. I was aware of the concept of the character of Kahless, but I had never read anything with him until the Prey trilogy, and when I listened to interviews by John said, ooh, well, I read some of the comics that had to do with Kahless, as well as the original Kahless novel by Michael Jan Friedman. And so, in the back of my mind, I've always wanted to read that Michael Jan Friedman novel, and I came across the hardcover and the paperback at the local used bookstore, and I'll be honest, I did not like the hardcover look at all. I thought the hardcover look was weak, but I actually really like the cover design of the mass market paperback. So I got this, and I read this book, and I was utterly entranced by it. In the first few pages of the book, Michael Jan Friedman explains that he wanted to write a fantasy novel in Star Trek. And I was like, oh, that's my jam. I love fantasy and I love Star Trek. A fantasy Star Trek, that's got to be brilliant. And I did read it, and it was brilliant. What made this book so interesting was you had 2 different eras that it told. In one era, you had Kahless the Unforgettable, the original Kahless, who is leading his armies, and he's becoming the leader of the Klingons that we know him to be. And then you have the modern day, quote unquote, modern day era of Kahless, which the Kahless the clone, and he's dealing with a plot to murder the Klingon Chancellor, and so he's trying to thwart that plot. Both plot lines were very well done. I will say I preferred the fantastical plot more because it was so different than anything I'd read in Star Trek, whereas the more modern plot was more normal for Star Trek, so I thought it was very fascinating. I thought it was a very light, not necessarily in tone, it was lighter than Game of Thrones in tone, but page-wise, it's like 100-something pages were devoted to the old Kahless, so it was like almost like a Game of Thrones novella. It felt like this nailed the feeling of a fantastical realm, and Kahless in this book reminded me of Robert Baratheon from the Game of Thrones books, the kind of, overweight warrior who's all about honor and fighting and things like that, and the story of him finding his true love and everything that goes on there. And it was just such a breath of fresh air in the Star Trek universe for me. And also, it had some cool ties to the other books that I've read, not just the Prey trilogy, but into the A Time 2 series and into other series. And so if you like Klingons, I'm sure you will very much enjoy this book, and this was why this is my number 5. The next book on my list, my number 4, is Star Trek Discovery Die Standing by John Jackson Miller. This is a book following Philippa Georgiou, who but it's not the Philippa Georgiou that we know. It is actually Emperor Georgiou from the Mirror Universe. So, ironically, this book could have been in the Mirror Universe line because it features a Mirror Universe character in the regular Star Trek universe. It also could have been a Section 31 book because Section 31 plays a major role in this book. But that's not all. This book also is a discovery book because it has many connections and references to Star Trek Discovery. Many of the characters, including admirals and captains and other major players from Discovery, make an appearance in this book, including the main character, Emperor Georgiou, and some new unique characters. You have characters like Dax. One of the early incarnations of Dax shows up. Her name is Emily Dax, and she was a very fascinating version because this is a very early Dax symbiote. And then there's one other character that I don't want to reveal that I thought was very, very fun. It was a very humorous character that shows up that I thought was very entertaining. But this book, it tells of Philippa Georgiou. Now, all of a sudden, what is she going to do in the Prime Universe? And she is co-opted by Section 31 to go on this mission for them. But what Section 31 doesn't know is that she has ulterior motives of her own. And what she doesn't know is that Section 31 has other ulterior motives that they haven't told her about. And so it's this big game of backstabbing and who's going to get ahead of who, and it's just an entertaining story. I was grinning ear to ear throughout it. I read this book super fast. And this book, by the way, won the Scribe Award in 2020. It came out in 2020, so the award was given in 2021, but it won the Scribe Award for Best Speculative Fiction, and it was absolutely deserving. I think that this book, it did not get well read in the fandom for some reason. I think it's because it wasn't marketed well. I think that people weren't interested in reading about Philippa Georgiou, but I promise you it is, if you're a Star Trek fan, it's worth it. I don't like Star Trek Discovery. I find it very frustrating and very anti-Star Trek to what I like to be in Star Trek. But the Star Trek books for Discovery are fantastic, particularly the ones by John Jackson Miller. His Enterprise War was great, and this book was utterly fantastic. The next book on my list is Star Trek Picard, The Last Best Hope by Una McCormack. And let me say, of all the books I read on my list, this one caught me by surprise the most. I read this book after having watched the whole season of Picard this year, and I didn't, much like Discovery, I didn't care for Picard. And I really didn't like all the characters in Picard, but a lot of them show up here. And I'm a Litverse person. I like the post-Nemesis books a lot. So when this book and Picard itself overrode that, I was very frustrated. But what made this book so good was the way that Una McCormack told a political storyline that made me question the way I would handle things. I very much have a different political bent than Una McCormack and many of the other Star Trek writers. But Una presents arguments of both sides incredibly well, and she's very nuanced, and she makes me feel emotion for the characters, even the characters I despise. There were several characters in this, I'm like, I know you're a bad guy, I know you're despicable, but I feel bad that you're going through what you're going through. And I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful thing that Una McCormack was able to do in that. And so this book does something that all the best Star Trek, or really tie-in books, should do. It should answer questions that the products, the movies or television shows weren't able to do. That's one of the hallmarks of tie-in fiction, is it fills in the gaps. This book fills in so much of the gaps, and I actually appreciate the Picard series a lot more after having read this book, and that's a good thing. That is exactly what tie-in books should do, and this book is one of the most successful in that arena. And that is why this is my number standalone so far. Of course, as I read more Star Trek books, I will have new lists, and I will be updating you on how I feel, where my top 5s and top 10s are. Number 2 on my list is The Antares Melstrom by Greg Cox. This is the only book I've read thus far by Greg Cox, although as I'm recording this video, I am currently reading another Greg Cox book, so I'll have more thoughts on him as an author, but this book, whoo boy, was this an interesting book. what this book did is it was very standalone. Like, all these books are standalone. This book's a standalone. What this did is it told a gold rush story, but in the Star Trek universe. Instead of finding gold, they find some other mineral. Instead of going out to the Wild West, they're going out to this this new planet that's being colonized. And you see these Wild West tropes. It's not necessarily Western tropes, I wouldn't say, although they may creep in. I would say this is more gold rush tropes from California and Oregon that seep into this book. And it was just, it felt so refreshing to read a book that was just taking all these themes and applying them in that way. And you have characters who are misusing the talents that they have, and you have characters who are trying to get ahead, and characters who are trying to do things that they shouldn't be doing. And you also have the Enterprise crew, and what Greg Cox does really well is balance the characters. You have some of them, you know, of course, Kirk and Spock and McCoy all get great character moments. In fact, this has a I'm a doctor, darn it, not a something or other. This has one of those lines in it, which was great. But it also includes great character moments from Scotty, has great character moments from Uhura, and particularly Sulu gets some great moments in this book. It balances the characters just right. It ties into a line from The Wrath of Khan, I will hunt you down to the Antares Melstrom. And so you learn what that is in this book. And it felt like classic Trek to me, and it was so enjoyable to read. This was the first trade paperback of the TOS books that I read, and it got me really invested in getting more TOS. And so if there's more TOS like this, I'm going to be very excited. And that's my number 2. My number 1 will probably come as a shock to nobody if you've watched my channel for a while, and that is Star Trek The Next Generation Takedown by John Jackson Miller. If you noticed, I already have a John Jackson Miller book on here, which was Die Standing. He's such a good writer, he got 2 on this list because they're both excellent. This book was one of the first Star Trek books I read. It still holds up. It is very much tying into, it is a book taking place in the post-Nemesis universe, but it is tying into an episode from The Next Generation. One of the reasons why it has the Next Generation title, it features the crews of the Aventine and the crew of Next Gen on the Enterprise E, and then also includes Riker and some of the connections to his crew. And basically, this book is Riker takes over the Aventine and starts doing some bad stuff. And nobody knows why. And only Picard is the one person who knows his friend well enough to be able to stop him. And so it's Riker versus Picard in this very fun action adventure story where you never set foot on a planet. It's all in the ships chasing each other around the quadrant, the Alpha Quadrant. And it's just a beautiful, wonderful story about a captain against his former first officer, and how do you deal with, now that Riker's an admiral at this point in the storyline, how does Picard deal with his old friend now being his boss in some ways, and he believes that he's doing things wrong, and there's a great mystery element to the book. But what really elevates this book is its political and thematic undertones. The whole concept of the Typhon Pact has great connections to the Cold War. And if you've read any of the Typhon Pact novels, you know this. But what this book does is it has connections to conferences that were made during the Cold War and even during World War II. And the conferences that take place really explore how the Romulans are very much like the communists of Russia, and how you have the Tholians and you have these other groups are like the communists in China, and how you have communists in all these other countries, and how they all have very different styles of communism, but they all unite under one concept, which is being anti-capitalism, or in Star Trek, being anti-Federation. And then you have the Kittimer Accord group, which includes the Ferengi and includes the Klingons and includes the Federation and others. And it represents how capitalism in the US is different from capitalism in England and all these things, but they all tie together and they all fight communism in the same way. And so you have that fun conference that shows up, and then you have a villain. He's not the villain of the book, but he's a villain in the book who's just pathetic. He's kind of like, he's the laughing stock of the group. He's like the Theon Greyjoy, if you remember from season 2 of Game of Thrones. He's like the Theon Greyjoy of Star Trek. And you just look down at him, you're like, you're an idiot. And he was such a funny character to read about. And he has some moments that make you go, oh, I didn't see that coming. And so it's just everything about this book is utterly delightful. It has a wonderful mystery, and it has you going, oh, I want to read so much more about this. And yet it's also satisfying at the end. So that is my top 5 list of favorite Star Trek standalones. If you've read Star Trek standalones, do you think I have a good list? Do you have a different list? Let me know what your list looks like. Let me know if there's any books you really think I need to read that are standalones because you think they're excellent books that you think would make my list. Let me know down in the comments. Please subscribe to the channel and like this video and check out all my other Star Trek. I have a lot of Star Trek content on the channel. But until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.